In 1988, Rome believed the problem could be solved with a decree, a signature, a sentence, an excommunication. 38 years later, the same crisis has returned. But this time the situation is even more dangerous because the numbers are no longer the same, the structure is no longer fragile, and the faithful are no longer isolated. And now the Superior General of the Society of Saint Pius X is saying openly what many inside the Church already fear privately. What is coming could be worse than 1988, not because the fraternity is preparing a rebellion, but because the fracture inside the Church has become too visible to hide any longer. By the end of this video, you will understand why Don Davide Pagliarani's latest warning is not simply about episcopal consecrations. It is about the future survival of Catholic tradition itself. And you will understand why Rome may already know that whatever happens on the 1st of July, 2026, the old strategy no longer works. Let's begin with the facts. On the 21st of May 2026, the official website of the Society of Saint Pius X published a confidential internal letter signed by Superior General Don Davide Pagliarani. The document had originally been dated March 7th and circulated privately among priests and members of the fraternity. But once it became public, one sentence immediately spread throughout traditional Catholic circles around the world. The state of necessity invoked in 1988 is even more evident today. Even more evident. Not equal, not similar. Worse, this is the key. Because Pagliarani is not speaking emotionally. He is speaking canonically. The phrase state of necessity is one of the most serious concepts in the entire code of canon law. It refers to situations in which the salvation of souls is considered gravely endangered. And according to Canon 1323, actions normally punishable under church law may not incur automatic penalties if carried out under genuine necessity. This is the exact argument Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre used in 1988 when he consecrated 4 bishops in Econ without papal mandate. The Vatican responded immediately. On the 1st of July 1988, Rome declared Lefebvre and the 4 newly consecrated bishops excommunicated. The accusation was schism. The punishment was latae sententiae, automatic excommunication. And at the time, many inside the Vatican believed the society would collapse within years. Instead, something unexpected happened. The fraternity grew. In 1988, the SSPX had roughly 200 priests. Today, it has over 700. In 1988, it had limited geographic reach. Today, it operates in more than 50 countries. Schools, seminaries, retreat houses, chapels, pilgrimages, thousands of families, hundreds of thousands of faithful. The punishment intended to isolate the movement ended up multiplying its visibility. This historical reality changes everything in 2026, because Rome is no longer confronting a small resistant group gathered around one aging French archbishop. It is confronting an international structure with institutional continuity, young clergy, and a growing base of faithful Catholics convinced that the crisis inside the Church has deepened dramatically since the time of Lefebvre. This is why Pagliarani's words matter so much. He is not announcing a temporary protest. He is describing what he believes to be a structural emergency inside Catholicism itself. And according to him, that emergency now exceeds the conditions of 1988. Let's understand why. The society currently has only 2 active bishops. Both are elderly. One bishop died in 2024, another in 2025. Without bishops, priests cannot be ordained. Without priests, seminarians cannot continue formation. Without formation, the fraternity disappears within 1 generation. This is the practical reality behind the July 1st consecrations in Econ. And this is why Pagliarani insists repeatedly that the issue is not politics, not ideology, not institutional pride, but the survival of sacramental continuity, the salvation of souls. This phrase appears constantly throughout his letter, and he explicitly warns members of the fraternity not to reduce it to rhetoric or strategy, because he knows critics will immediately accuse the SSPX of using state of necessity as a pretext. But Pagliarani answers before the accusation even arrives. He says the necessity is not theoretical. It is visible, concrete, documented, and worsening. This is where the conflict becomes far more uncomfortable for Rome. Because while the Vatican prepares possible sanctions against the society, many Catholics observe something else happening simultaneously across the Church. German bishops openly discussing blessings for irregular unions. Public synodal reports questioning moral categories previously considered definitive. Liturgical experimentation, doctrinal ambiguity, growing confusion surrounding sacramental identity, and perhaps most importantly, silence from Rome toward many of these developments. This creates the central paradox. A Vatican that tolerated years of doctrinal tension without formal excommunications now prepares severe action against priests whose central public identity remains attachment to traditional liturgy and doctrine. And this contradiction is precisely what Pagliarani highlights indirectly throughout the letter. Without bitterness, without insults, without revolutionary language, that detail matters enormously, because one of the most striking parts of the letter is not its criticism. It is its restraint. Pagliarani writes, "We must continue to love the Church even if her official representatives declare us excommunicated and schismatic once again." This is not the language of separation. It is the language of tragic conflict, and that distinction changes everything. He does not speak like a man founding a new church. He speaks like a man convinced he is preserving something. He believes Rome itself is failing to protect adequately. Whether one agrees with him or not, this psychological and theological framework is essential for understanding the crisis. The SSPX does not see itself as abandoning Rome. It sees itself as preserving Catholic continuity during institutional confusion. This is exactly why the situation has become so dangerous, because both sides now claim fidelity to the Church while interpreting the crisis in radically opposite ways. Rome sees unauthorized consecrations as disobedience, threatening ecclesial unity. The society sees them as emergency measures necessary for preserving tradition and sacramental continuity. And history complicates the issue even further. Because Benedict XVI himself partially validated the existence of a real crisis when he lifted the excommunications in 2009. That decision was monumental, not merely juridically, symbolically. Benedict admitted publicly that the conflict could not be solved through punishment alone. He acknowledged that turning one's back on part of the Church had solved nothing. That sentence still haunts the present crisis. Because now Catholics ask a painful question. If 1988 ended with revocation, what happens if Rome repeats the same strategy in 2026? Will history simply repeat itself again? Or will the consequences be even more severe? Pagliarani clearly believes the second possibility is real, and this explains the title now spreading throughout traditionalist media. What's coming could be worse than 1988. Not necessarily because sanctions will be harsher, but because the internal fracture inside the Church is now deeper, broader, and more visible than it was 38 years ago. In 1988, social media did not exist. Most Catholics barely understood what the SSPX even was. Today, millions of faithful can follow events instantly across YouTube, Telegram, X, live streams, independent Catholic media, and traditionalist networks operating globally. Every Vatican statement is analyzed within minutes. Every contradiction amplified immediately. Every silence interpreted. And Rome knows this. A new excommunication today would not occur quietly. It would become one of the most discussed religious events in the world within hours. This is why the stakes feel historically enormous, not because July 1st concerns only 4 future bishops in Switzerland, but because it concerns the credibility of authority itself inside an already fractured church. And perhaps this is the deepest line in Pagliarani's letter. We must never give in to bitterness, because bitterness destroys clarity. And clarity is exactly what both sides now claim to defend. What do you think? Is the SSPX protecting Catholic tradition during a genuine emergency, or risking a rupture that could deepen the crisis even further? Comment below. Amen. God bless you. There is one detail in Don Davide Pagliarani's letter that changes the entire meaning of this crisis. Most people missed it. They focused on the consecrations, the possible excommunications, the conflict with Rome. But the real center of the letter is somewhere else entirely. Pagliarani writes that Catholics must remain calm, even if they are publicly accused, marginalized, or declared outside communion. Why would a superior general preparing episcopal consecrations speak first about interior peace? Because he knows something history has already demonstrated many times. The greatest danger in a crisis is not persecution. It is despair. And perhaps, for the first time since 1988, the Society of Saint Pius X believes many faithful are approaching precisely that point. Let's understand the deeper context. The July 1st consecrations are not appearing in a vacuum. They come after years of mounting tensions inside the Church, Germany's synodal path, the debates surrounding fiducia supplicans, blessings for couples in irregular situations, public discussions about female diaconate, growing liturgical experimentation, and perhaps most importantly, increasing confusion among ordinary Catholics who no longer know whether certain teachings are permanent or negotiable. This is why Pagliarani repeatedly insists that the problem is doctrinal before it is canonical. Because from the Society's perspective, the crisis is not fundamentally about jurisdiction, it is about truth. And this explains something very important. The fraternity does not believe July 1st creates the crisis. It believes the crisis already exists, and that the consecrations are merely a response to it. That distinction changes everything. Because Rome presents the upcoming consecrations as a rupture of unity, the Society presents them as an attempt to preserve continuity during institutional instability. And both sides now speak with complete certainty. This is why the situation has become historically explosive. There is another layer many Catholics still do not fully grasp. The SSPX today is no longer isolated socially the way it was decades ago. In the 1990s, traditional Catholics often existed on the margins of parish life. Now, entire networks exist internationally. Schools, publishing houses, pilgrimages, independent media, large Catholic families raising children entirely within traditional communities. Young seminarians entering formation in growing numbers. In many countries, traditional Catholicism is no longer shrinking. It is growing, quietly, but steadily. And Rome sees this too. This is what makes the present moment so delicate, because a new excommunication in 2026 would not hit a collapsing movement. It would hit a movement convinced it has already survived Rome's strongest punishment once before. That memory matters psychologically, especially among younger priests. Most current SSPX seminarians were not even born in 1988. For them, the excommunications are history books. And history ended with Benedict XVI lifting the penalties. This creates a radically different mentality from the generation that lived through the original rupture. Many young traditional Catholics now view 1988 not as proof that the Society was destroyed, but as proof that Rome eventually recognized the situation was more complicated than initially presented. That perception changes the balance completely, and Rome knows it. This is why many Vatican observers believe the Holy See itself is deeply divided internally over how to respond. Some want firmness. Others fear repeating what Benedict XVI later implicitly acknowledged had been pastorally disastrous. Because once a punishment fails historically, repeating it becomes far riskier, especially if the second attempt produces the same outcome. And there is something else. Pagliarani's language throughout the letter is remarkably careful. He never attacks the papacy itself, never denies the authority of Rome, never calls for separation from the Church. Instead, he frames everything around necessity, continuity, and fidelity. That matters enormously in theological terms. Because the Society understands very well that open rejection of papal authority would instantly confirm Rome's accusations. So instead, Pagliarani positions the fraternity as loyal sons, acting under tragic circumstances. This is strategically brilliant and deeply uncomfortable for Vatican authorities, because it becomes much harder to portray the conflict as straightforward rebellion when the accused repeatedly profess obedience to Catholic tradition, love for the Church, and attachment to Rome itself. This is why the canonical debate surrounding Canon 1323 has become central. The Society believes the state of necessity excludes automatic excommunication. Rome disagrees, but the important point is this: the debate is no longer merely emotional. It is juridical, technical, historical, and theologians on both sides know the issue is far more complex than headlines suggest. Meanwhile, preparations in Econ continue openly. Registration systems are active. Pilgrims are organizing travel. Hotels are filling. Journalists are requesting accreditation. The biographies of the future bishops are expected soon. Everything now moves with irreversible momentum. And perhaps this is the most striking difference from 1988. Nothing feels improvised. In 1988, Lefebvre acted at the last minute after failed negotiations with Cardinal Ratzinger. In 2026, the Society appears methodical, organized, and psychologically prepared for consequences long in advance. That changes the atmosphere completely. This no longer feels like a sudden explosion. It feels like a calculated crossing of a line both sides know is approaching. And above all, hangs one terrible question. What happens after July 1st? Because even if excommunications are issued immediately, the practical reality will not disappear the next morning. The chapels will remain. The priests will remain. The schools will remain. The faithful will remain. And perhaps more importantly, the crisis inside the Church that produced this confrontation will also remain unresolved. This is why many Catholics increasingly sense that the real issue is larger than the SSPX itself. The fraternity has become a symbol of a much broader struggle over identity, continuity, doctrine, and authority in modern Catholicism, a visible manifestation of deeper tensions already present everywhere. And Pagliarani's warning reflects precisely this awareness. What's coming could be worse than 1988. Not because Rome is stronger, but because the divisions are deeper, because confusion is broader, because trust has weakened, and because millions of Catholics now consume information independently rather than through official diocesan channels alone. Control over the narrative no longer exists the way it once did. Every contradiction becomes public instantly. Every silence analyzed. Every inconsistency preserved permanently online. This creates a church environment unlike anything previous generations experienced. And perhaps this explains why Pagliarani emphasizes spiritual disposition more than institutional conflict. No bitterness, no hatred, no triumphalism. Because once anger becomes the center, clarity disappears. And for the Society, clarity is everything. The conviction that tradition is not nostalgia, not preference, not aesthetics, but survival. This is the heart of the entire crisis. Not merely who has authority, but what authority exists to preserve. In the end, this is why the coming weeks matter so much. Not because of politics, not because of internet controversy, but because Catholics everywhere are watching two radically different visions of the Church confront each other openly. One, emphasizing adaptation, synodality, and pastoral flexibility. The other, emphasizing continuity, doctrinal permanence, and sacramental preservation. And neither side believes the stakes are small anymore. July 1st is approaching quickly. The bishops will arrive in Econ. The ceremonies are already scheduled. The Vatican has already warned publicly, and Don Davide Pagliarani has already told his priests and faithful to prepare spiritually for what may come next. History rarely announces itself in advance, but sometimes it does. And perhaps this is one of those moments. What do you think? Will July first become another temporary crisis, eventually resolved like 1988? Or the beginning of something far deeper inside the Catholic Church? Comment below. Amen. God bless you.